The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here for yet another installment of Oak's Hour. In today's episode, I will be synthesizing topics and ideas that bloomed from my conversations with Sevi Mangrum, Tyson Adams, and Trevor Yelich. As is the case with each of these Oak's Hour episodes, if you haven't yet listened to the aforementioned ones, I would highly encourage you to do so at some point. Now, with that being said, let's look at the 5 questions that we will be exploring today. Firstly, how does our relationship with sexuality reflect and shape our ability to connect with ourselves and with others? 2. What might the practices of intentionality and reverence in sexuality teach us about vulnerability, trust, and our own human potential? Thirdly, what practical tools are available to help with the integration of sacrality, sexuality, intimacy, and relational growth in our daily lives? Fourth, how can the balancing of the masculine and feminine energies within us foster deeper intimacy and relational harmony? And lastly, how might communal co-creation enrich our ability to heal personally and collectively, as well as bring forward a greater standard of living the world over? I chose these questions as I believed they best blended the body-based insights of Sevi, the enlightened perspectives on sexuality shared by Tyson, and the nature of growth and healing explored by Trevor. With that, we're ready to begin. Question 1. How does our relationship with sexuality reflect and shape our ability to connect with ourselves and others? By and large, we live in an age of sexual bewilderment. We occupy a sexual wasteland. Now, I borrow these terms from author George Feuerstein and his book Sacred Sexuality, the Erotic Spirit in the World's Great Religions. It should be said that he borrowed these terms from other writers referenced in that book. The wasteland in question evokes images of a barren, lifeless, and isolated landscape, one that fails to bring forward or support life. Desolate and empty, perhaps a shadow of its former self. This describes the relationship that we carry culturally to sex and sexuality in our modern ethos. This is a result of the shame-based and puritanical perspectives of the Abrahamic religions and their influence on our culture's development. And as such, millions of people have grown to believe that their sexuality is base, sinful, ungodly, and a, quote, necessary evil, end quote. Being that the Abrahamic faiths have, by a 2020 consensus, roughly 4.5 billion members, and even more whose lives have been touched by their anti-sex rhetoric, the scope of this disconnection is absolutely prolific. Notably, not all of the world's religious and spiritual traditions exile or condemn the human erotic spirit. For some, it serves as a sacred path into the deepest union possible with the source of being itself. However, such ideas do not dominate the global mindset or narratives. Generations of our kin have found themselves impossibly immersed in this aforementioned wasteland, a landscape whose punitive topography encourages repression and confusion. It is these very qualities that characterize the bewilderment I mentioned a few moments ago. What our erotic nature is, could be, or even ought to be, is currently befuddled and distorted by the images and idols of a society wrought with hundreds, if not thousands of years of misplaced and fracturing shame. So, how does our relationship with sexuality reflect and shape our ability to connect with ourselves and others? Well, this clearly depends on the scope of our understanding of the genuine nature of our sexuality and the wholeness of our humanity more broadly. We might do well to imagine that one's relationship to sex and sexuality falls on a spectrum from the ultimately fractured and fragmented to the ultimately embodied and activated states of sacred ecstasy. Thus, to answer the question at hand, we'll need to set a clear target, which I will take to be illuminating the consequences of varied degrees of fragmentation or repression as it pertains to one's erotic spirit on our relationship to self and other. Now, before we dive in, it behooves me to note that all individuals fall on a spectrum of libido intensity and or interest in sex. This too plays an influential role in how one's relationship to sex and sexuality manifests in the quality of their connection to self and other. It constitutes a variable that I will not be directly accounting for in the following investigation. With that being said, what are the more extreme consequences of the internalized fragmentation as it pertains to one's relationship to sex, sexuality, self, and other? Shame, guilt, and the development of the sexual shadow. Both shame and guilt have, at their core, a judgment of wrongness or badness. This is most often an internalization of an external rejection, either direct or inferred, and depending on the so-called object of judgment, the ensuing emotion will be either primarily shame or guilt. The major meaningful difference between shame and guilt, as I have just noted, is the focal point of the judgment. For shame, the object is the sense of self, the personhood or the ego self, the notions that there is something wrong with me, or I am bad, sinful, and defective, reasonably showcase this spirit of shame. Guilt, on the other hand, takes one's actions as the object of judgment or rejection. I've done something wrong, or I have sinned, characterize guilt. It can be easily seen how such a guilt-inducing notion could also generate shame, especially if one believes that their goodness or their worthiness of love depends exclusively on the quality of their actions. This perception is understood as a moralistic judgment, that is to say, painting a person as wrong as a result of one of their supposed wrongdoings. Such judgments are not limited to one's self or one's own actions. Far too frequently, in fact, we see such judgments used to justify the brutal dehumanization of an outgroup, painting them as wrong or bad as a result of the action of one of their members. Now, being that both shame and guilt flow from inner rejection, they are to be considered bedfellows of the sexual shadow. The shadow, for our context, is to be understood as it was put forward by Carl Jung. His conception of the shadow can be stated thusly. The shadow is an unconscious aspect of the personality that does not align with the ego ideal. It consists of repressed ideas, desires, weaknesses, instincts, and shortcomings deemed to be unacceptable not only by society, but also by one's own morals and values. The frame of being unacceptable is a mirroring of the rejection that we spoke to earlier. To not accept is to reject, and we would benefit at present from acknowledging that shame, guilt, and the shadow all carry an ideal of standard against which the ego self or an action is measured. It's the source and the nature of this ideal that we can identify as the repressive and puritanical spillover from the Abrahamic roots of our current culture. When I spoke with Tyson Adams in episode 6, he named 3 S's that plague male sexuality in our current psychocultural climate, these being secrecy, silence, and shame. It's plain to see, as far as I can tell, how whatever has been judged as sinful, repugnant, unacceptable, or wrong would move its home into the secretive, the silent, and the unseen. What this guilt and shame-induced repression does to one's ability to relate to self and other is nothing short of devastating. It walls off a natural and integral part of one's own humanity. making the fullest integration and the greatest authentic expression of oneself inaccessible. This self-rejection, should it remain unconscious, very often manifests as projections. This is where the individual outwardly rejects those aspects of others that they've rejected in themselves. This, in turn, all but eliminates the opportunity for authentic relating and intimacy to occur, as these are the foundations of healthy and sustainable relationships. How could we ever hope to love something that we refuse to accept? Furthermore, those desires, instincts, and characteristics that have been exiled into the shadow do not go away. Their liveliness and their essential nature do not dissipate, and therefore the natural compulsion to satiate such needs and desires remains. They're simply forced to take indirect routes to their respective ends. Addiction, compulsions, fixations, anxiety, and malaise are just some of the ways that these repressed energies make themselves manifest. Think for a moment about how someone with uncontrollable compulsions, secret and shameful addictions, and deep self-rejection would relate to the world and to others. Are you picturing an open-hearted, vital, creative, and joyful individual with healthy and thriving relationships? Or do you see someone whose lion's share of daily efforts is dedicated to keeping their head above the water, living in constant fear of being discovered for their true and unacceptable self? If one's understanding and felt sense of their sexuality is infected with unjust denial and rejection, then they will find themselves in a constant battle against the very power of nature that brought them forth and that sustains their being. But what exactly is missing? What gets lost when judgment and rejection lead our development? I would say, at the very least, reverence and sacrality, a deep sense of the sacred and the whole nature of our and all being. And this leads us now into our next point of inquiry. What might the practices of intentionality and reverence in sexuality teach us about vulnerability, trust, and our own human potential? Our wholeness, the completeness of our being, remains with us throughout the entirety of our lives, regardless of our level of awakening or repression. Thus, whatsoever is to be gained through reawakening to our sacred sexuality is not gained through the external world, but rather through a rejoining, a reweaving, or a reconnection with our true nature. Therefore, the learning that takes place happens as a result of the revelation of truths that are already here, but have gone unseen, ignored, or repressed. With that being said, let us spend a brief moment defining what is meant by intentionality and by reverence. Intentionality, the quality of being done on purpose or with intent. Intent signifies an objective or an aim. We can say that if something was intentional, that it was meant to happen that way. The two key elements are doing, this is the act, and purpose, a preconceived aim which requires the activation and alignment of both mind and will. Let us now turn to reverence. Reverence, an attitude of deep respect tinged with awe, veneration. A closer examination of the word awe and veneration will serve us now, as an understanding of the root of these terms will clarify how reverence is enacted through us. Veneration, it carries the historical connotation of worship and profound respect. That which is venerated is treated thusly precisely because it is meritorious and deserving of respect. Now, an investigation could be made into the reasons for and the consequences of venerating anything that is unworthy or profane, but that journey is surely for another day. Many things, actions, and people are worthy of great respect, but I would put forward, in my humble opinion, that none are worthy of worship. Why? Well, to worship is to honor the sacred. and the holy. And thus, we might also say to worship is to enact both the assertion that and to recognize whatever is being worshipped as the highest possible principle, or divine, that which is ultimately worthy of reverence. This highest principle can be called God, Creator, Source, the universe, or any other holy name, and yet in each instance of naming, we're pointing to that which transcends the limited and finite qualities that define our humanity, our history, and our language. Now let us briefly examine the idea of awe. Awe, an overwhelming feeling of admiration, reverence, or fear produced by that which is grand, sublime, or extremely powerful. The oldest roots and cognates for awe actually mean fear and pain. Now, it might seem that we're sliding back into that repressive ethos, but rest assured, we are not. That which is powerful and capable of generating pain and suffering demands to be treated with sufficient intentionality such that we maximize the likelihood of avoiding becoming entirely ruined in the process of relating with that source of power. It's entirely natural to fear that which is more powerful than you and that which is capable of eliciting pain and suffering. Perfectly normal. Okay. So with these expanded definitions, we can return to our question renewed. What might we learn about vulnerability, trust, and our human potential by approaching sexuality with sufficient respect for its transformational and creative power, as well as with the recognition of its sacrality? I'm taking it as fact that sexuality is a vehicle of great creative and transformational power. It makes people, and people very often report mystical or transcendent experience through lovemaking. If you disagree with this assertion, please leave your reasoning in the comment section below. Firstly, it appears that the very same force that brought forth our bodies has been given unto us. We are creators. We are the micro to the macro of this great and ultimate cosmic creation. We are imbued with a sacred power that demands respect and reverence, lest we desire to plunge into the shadowy depths of ignorance and suffering. We may also come to see that this sacrality, this divine spark, is the spark of our sexual essence, and that it permeates all that we are. Now, I'm not saying that we are solely sexual entities, but rather that we are entirely sacred beings. This recognition within ushers us into a direct confrontation with our wholeness. What might we become if all of our many and flawed facets were welcomed with as much zeal and appreciation as we show our skills? For even one person to approach such a state of acceptance would mean that the web of their relations would be immediately changed. Why do I say this? Well, recall that the internalized rejection we spoke to earlier resurfaces as projection and condemnation of the other. Thus, to picture any relationship where one party is holy and completely free of judgment is to witness a moment of resonant love. As for intentionality and purposefulness, such a quality of action requires the activation and alignment of the mind and of the will. I will now also add that the wisdom of the heart ought to guide the activities brought forth by this alignment and activation. To activate and to align the mind and will insofar as it relates to one's sexuality is to allow the full character of one's sexual nature to be witnessed and explored through the lens of premise and potential. Another way to say that is free thinking, free imagining, and free inquiring into one's sexual nature with reverence and towards the end of self-actualization. This takes the place of any previous repression, condemnation, or rejection. Our sense of no or bad or Wrong is then replaced with a respectful and reverent curiosity, one that is guided by sacred principles and awareness. So then, moving on to question 3. What practical tools are available to us to help with the integration of this sacrality, our sexuality, intimacy, and relational growth inside of our daily lives? Well, for those whose erotic spirit is deeply in shadow, shame, and secrecy, I would encourage you to seek dialogue with a competent and trusted counselor or therapist, one with whom you have a sense of trust and whose learning background aligns with the cultural sources of your repression. For those who are already actively unweaving their web, then joining a support group whose structures and members are compassionate and open to receiving your inner process is an excellent first step. Dialogue is a powerful antidote to shame. And I've learned this through the work of Brené Brown, where she puts forward the notion that shame shared shrinks. Furthermore, and being that our sexuality is body-based, then the integration of somatic experiencing and embodiment practices is a viable and effective path to reconnecting our minds and hearts to our whole body. This might be non-sexual embodiment practices, or the mindful exploration of a reverent pleasure practice. You might also consider the support of a sexological body worker. There's a great deal that can be unlocked or unplugged or opened with the wise and caring support of another. Following from this, other forms of presence and embodiment practices can be of service as well. Meditation, contemplation, sexual qigong, or breath work, when approached with reverent curiosity for one's authentic nature, are each a means of self-discovery and of healing. The core of these practices is in relating, how we relate to our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our body, our movement, our pleasure, and our memories. If we hope to relate to these aspects of ourselves with any degree of mastery, it's prudent to remember that both the masculine, the yang, and the feminine, the yin, energies exist within each of us, and that they are continually striving for balance and harmony. Which brings us to question number 4. How can the balancing of these two energies within us foster deeper intimacy and relational harmony? The more we know about our true self, the closer we come to compassion. This loving self-awareness can go by other names, perhaps understanding or acceptance. This energy, be it compassion or acceptance, is the very foundation of intimacy. But what do I mean by this? Well, firstly, we have to know what we mean when we say intimacy. Intimacy is a closeness in relating, a knowledge or an understanding arising from a connection to something or someone. And of course, it can also mean sexual relations. Closeness and knowing. It ought to be noted that it is impossible to know a lie. We can only believe lies. Thus, it's clearly the case that we can only know that which is true. Insofar as this pertains to intimacy, we must now introduce the idea of authenticity into the equation. Authenticity is the sharing in the truth of one's humanity and experience in the present moment, and thus constitutes, when it's received as such, an intimate act. Genuine closeness and intimacy can only come when we share the truth of our being and of our experience. If and when we deny ourselves the conscious exploration of the full spectrum of our human nature, be it our emotions, desires, fantasies, fears, pleasures, shames, joys, what have you, then we're necessarily limiting our capacity to be intimate with other people. This is because the depth and potency of our authenticity will be limited by our unwillingness or our inability to bear accepting witness to the truth of our inner world. Whatever truths you refuse to acknowledge about yourself serve as the ropes that constrict the flow of intimacy and shared knowing in all of your relationships. But how does the balancing of masculine and feminine energies address such an undesirable state? Well, The act of balancing actually facilitates the quality of self-knowledge that is needed for authentic intimacy. We balance these energies first by acknowledging that they exist. We can then begin to understand their nature well enough, through curious inquiry, to identify when they are out of balance. Knowing their nature and their relationship equips you with enough information to take meaningful action. I recognize at this point that this is all quite general, so I would like to explore with greater specificity as to clarify the point at hand. So for starters, in my conversation with Sevi in episode 5, we closed by speaking to the differences between the masculine and feminine approaches to movement, physicality, and life in general. Now, if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely go check it out after this one. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. So, as it pertains to knowledge of self beyond movement, we can picture the following dance, and this was inspired by Sevi's insights. Okay, so the masculine energy inside has a desire to know something. It has a target and an aim. So it constructs a question and provides to the spaciousness or the void within this question. This is the depths of your inner world. The feminine energy within then receives that question fully and hopefully births an insight that is nourishing and illuminating from the depths of the unknown. The masculine energy from which that question came can now shifting from the giver into a mode of receptivity should it wish to benefit from that which was birthed by the feminine. Receiving is a yin act. Thus, the practice of self-inquiry, as described here, is a dance between the penetration provided by the inquiry of the masculine and the deep receptive listening and wise generative nature that flows from the feminine. We are both the leader and the led, the provider and the generous receiver. We nurture and we protect the valuable and vulnerable truths that surface within. Understanding how the universal feminine and masculine energies flow through you will support in the cultivation of the very same quality of acceptance that we touched on earlier, the acceptance that serves to dissolve rejection and condemnation. This in turn makes the space available to fully receive another, and thus the coming to know and be known that constitutes authentic and true intimacy. In short, balancing these energies means knowing yourself more clearly and deeply, and thus is ultimately a nourishing practice that feeds intimacy and harmony within all relationships. Safe, authentic, intimate relationships are the very opposite of the wasteland that we spoke to at the outset of this episode. When we are safe to be our whole selves, our vitality is affirmed and amplified. The innate and powerful creative essence awakens from its shadowy slumber and can be explored and directed with wise intention to ends that are far greater than short-term hedonic gratification, ego validation, or disassociative soothing. Not only do we awaken to the spirituality of sex, pleasure, and creation, but we awaken to our innate and ever-present role as a co-creator of reality. Being that this essence, our sexual essence, is relational, we can envision and bear witness to the generation of healthy, wise, and sustainable modes of living and relating to self, community, and the planet. And this brings us to our fifth and final question for the episode. How might this communal co-creation enrich our ability to heal personally and collectively and bring forward a greater standard of living for the world over? Our human body was never meant to exist in isolation. From the moment of our birth, we are alive with expectancies to be placed in and received by the world as mother or as family or community. We expect that the wholeness of our being has a place and that there's a role awaiting for us, that our needs will be met and that all of the gaps in our learning are ready to be filled by those who await our arrival. we are made to fulfill our own unique role in this web of life. We can therefore surmise that our creative capacity that is generated by our sacred and sexual nature is made to co-create, or rather to create in relationship and collaboration with the world by which we find ourselves inescapably ensconced. Great. So if you were born ready and able to collaboratively create with others as a part of your intrinsic and sacred nature, then that means so was everybody else. This nature never leaves us, nor is this capacity ever fully removed. It merely becomes dormant as a result of the fracturing and the repression that we attended to earlier. The dire situations that we face globally can be seen to flow from the ubiquitous disconnection and disempowerment of this innate creative and sacred aspect of our being. Thereby reconciling the fragmentations individually, we do so globally and collectively as well. We're then actively participating in the transformation of the collective consciousness of the whole of humanity. By reawakening to our innate, lovable, and ecstatic wholeness, we beckon others into the same through the encouraging vehicle of our perceptive and accepting wholeness. Remember, we only reject and condemn others when we are rejecting and condemning aspects of ourselves. The dissolution of such widespread rejection and othering constitutes an instantiation of transformational healing. Coming to see all of our parts as intrinsic, necessary, and acceptable is the micro to the macro of placing ourselves inside the greater tapestry of human history. We awaken to what is meant to be human beyond the ego self. And when we recover our pieces from exile, so too do we return back to our rightful place among our human and more than human kin. Let us conclude then with a brief summary and recapitulation of the relevant steps we've made on our journey today. We began by exploring the current cultural state of our relationship to sexuality and some of its relevant causes. We explored how the consequences of these causes have generated generations burdened by shame and guilt, deeply disconnected from the sense of wholeness. We then explored how the introduction of reverence, sacrality, and intention can begin to help us change course back towards an illuminated and loving relationship to ourselves and to others. Such introductions are supportive as they pry back open the doorways and channels that were slammed shut by condemnation and shame, and thus allow for the remembrance or the re-emergence of our wholeness to take place. We touched on some practical steps to begin such a reopening journey, as well as how embodiment practices serve in this reconnection even further. We then turned to identifying how the internal familiarity with both the feminine and masculine energies supports both the reintegration of one's sacred sexuality and the generation of healthy and authentic intimacy. Lastly, we explored the elements of relationality and community as the means by which this new and innate creative power can be activated for the benefit of many, far surpassing the limited temptations of short-term hedonic gratification, ego validation, or dissociative soothing. The entirety of this episode has been undertaken in the hopes of encouraging you to turn your sights and senses inward, such that you might succeed in reclaiming aspects of your being that may still be rejected, ever yearning to return to their rightful place. I sincerely pray that you succeed in this endeavor, and that in doing so, you come into deeper connection with your authentic power and your wholeness. And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you can like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.